Hello, I'm Megan Sullivan, and I'm going to talk about urban education and media. I decided to do a voiceover on a PowerPoint for my creative project to kind of talk about urban education represented throughout the media and review the three pieces of media that I watched and talked about in the media critiques that we had to do. I'll review them separately and tell a little bit about kind of what my takeaways were. So, like I said in class, when we say urban, particularly when white folks say urban, we mean black, and it's a coded way to avoid saying that black, brown, usually African American folks, Latinx folks, communities of color, and poverty is what we inherently mean when we say urban. UAB is an urban campus, but people don't think of it as urban. In fact, it doesn't get called that unless it's kind of some trendy report or something like that by most white folks because they don't see it that way. What they're meaning is poor black and brown communities in city centers, and they mean things like violence and lack of resources and falling apart buildings. And when we use the word urban, it doesn't just mean a geographic location. It isn't just a descriptor of the setting of the location. It is also the values, the morals, the resource allotment, all of the things that kind of pile on with that word. And it's a way for especially white folks to talk about those things without talking about them. If you say urban, you don't have to address racism. If you say urban, you don't have to address poverty. It just sounds like it's a city problem and not a structural problem that white folks and middle class folks and suburban folks directly contribute to and cause. And if you look up urban student on Google, which is what I did for my first slide, this is what you get. And so you can see that these associations with black and brown students, communities of color, are represented in Google, which is now kind of our prime way of seeing how we interpret the world because everyone uses Google. It's on our phones. And if you look at the top of this picture, you can see what the most associated terms, the suggestions that they're giving me: high school, black, learning, middle school, rural, poverty, racially diverse. So you can see kind of, what people are thinking. And this was a direct search for urban students that came up. In movies, it has been extremely popular. This is just a few that I didn't watch because I had seen all of these. Blackboard Jungle from the 1950s showing, the ridiculous, overly dramatic, a horrible place that schools were in, this terrifying world, a lot of racial tensions, Dangerous Minds, and then in the corner down there, Freedom Riders. These white saviors coming into these black schools, and all they need is poetry and a course in literature to find themselves. And that's what they need. They just need these strong white ladies to come in and save the day, and all of their issues are suddenly better. Boys in the Hood, which was, starred more black folks. It did not have the white savior mentality, and it showed the perspective of more of a decaying structural community supports. And then Lean on Me, which actually has a black principal come in and use some pretty controversial, pretty strong arm techniques to keep things like drugs and violence out of the school. And then in the middle was Save the Last Dance, which is when a white girl wants to go to Juilliard, so she goes to an urban school and learns hip hop, as you can see there, along with that 90s fashion. And so, these representations, they could seem minor. They might seem like they don't really matter, but when we're developing our ideas about who people are, we are strongly influenced by the media, by what we see. And every single one of those movies that I showed you before, I saw as a child, as a white child growing up in a predominantly white area. The only people of color were mostly migrant workers, Latinx folks who were working farms and things like that in my rural Appalachian town that I grew up in. So the ideas that I had about, particularly black folks, were formed through the media, through what I was hearing from people, but it wasn't a huge conversation. But mostly what I saw on television, because I didn't have a lot of exposure. And so it definitely affects how people think about urban education, about people who live in the cities, particularly people of color. And a lot of that imagery can be internalized as well. So I found this picture. I thought it was really great. So this is kind of how we imagine the world. This is that meritocracy, the pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or Americana sort of idea. So we just need everybody to have a ladder. Let's get to where we go. But when we're talking about urban education, we're talking about poverty, and we're talking about systemic racism. We are talking about people who are starting from a much different height, who have a lot more supports and are not even talking about level playing fields, or playing a different game entirely. And I really thought that this was a good representation of that. So before I go too long, the three things that I looked at was that episode of Blackish where they're talking about Junior, who is the eldest son. Oh gosh, look how young he looks there. He is potentially going to the local public school as opposed to the private school. His parents, his mom's a doctor. His dad is like a super ad executive. Big deal. They make a ton of money. And so they all go to private schools, and the conversations that they have. And then there's Akeelah and the Bee, which is about this girl who's super, super smart, and she's from a failing urban school, and she doesn't want to originally, but she's really good at spelling, and she kind of gets pushed into doing spelling bees, and then she loves it. And then she's amazing and awesome and brilliant, and it kind of goes from there. And then The Hate U Give, which is a more recent one, which is about this girl whose family lives in a pretty poor inner city area, but they go to a much more affluent white school. I don't remember if it's a private school or if it's a charter school or something like that they go to in another neighborhood. But it's about kind of her splitting those two worlds and what that looks like. One of the things that seems to be a constant in all three of these is this idea of two worlds. So this black urban world versus this white suburban or affluent world. And Blackish really highlighted that. The public schools are something to be overcome. It's something that you rise above. Not going to an urban school is seen as a hallmark, even though Junior ends up kind of finding himself in the public school. They really, particularly the dad that grew up, first started out in public urban schools, really wanting his children to not experience that, but then also wanting his children to understand, what it means to be black and to have some of the community and cultural connections that he had growing up that he fears that they're missing out on because they go to an affluent all or predominantly white school. Akeelah and the Bee is another one that kind of navigates this idea of, assimilationist respectability politics versus urban education. And, you have the white principal using Akeelah as kind of his way to get his own glory. He's he's not shown as being like a white savior, but he has those mentalities. He's definitely shown to be someone who's trying to benefit off of her brilliance, as she, goes to nationals and wins and everything. And then The Hate You Give, I had a lot of conflicting ideas. I liked all of these, by the way. I watch Blackish now. I think it's really great. I started watching Grownish, which is it's such a silly show. It's so good. Love it. But all of these I really enjoyed. And the messages I felt were pretty conflicting with all of them. The Hate You Give, for example, I feel like it set up to be like it set us up to be something, and then in the end it kind of turned on it, because it was really going deep at like police brutality and code switching and the way in which black and brown folks have to be in order to survive and adapt to a white racist world, and what that means, and like leaving your community versus staying and planting roots, and I mean really good. And then towards the end it did do a little bit of it said something like, it's not the hate you give, it's the hate we give. So talking about like black on black crime and having the drug dealer, the drug king, become the main villain. It had some really mixed messages that I feel like, particularly for white folks, not that those conversations are extremely important, but I feel like for white folks watching this, that's a good excuse to forget our own complicity in white supremacy and police brutality and state violence, because, oh, black on black crime. And I know that this movie wasn't made for a white audience, and that's great, and it definitely doesn't need to be, but that's just something I was reflecting on as I watched it. Basically, because I know I'm talking a whole lot, that it's very difficult to find good representations of urban education. I think back on even the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and him, leaving his urban school and then going to Bel-Air, and kind of like the jokes that were played, and it's just trying to find a good nuanced representation of urban schooling that talks about things in a really critical way is very hard to do. One thing I really appreciate about Blackish is that they take these moments out. They break the fourth wall and they say, hey, this is how slavery contributed to this. This is what segregation looks like. They do a full-on history course right in the middle, which I think is a brilliant and wonderful way to do things, because it's such a fun, goofy show that has real information in it. And while, media, I definitely don't think we should hold it to the standards that we hold everything, because it does have to be consumable and it isn't made for social justice. I think they're doing a pretty good job of it. But there's definitely, it's extremely difficult to find good, nuanced representations of urban media, of urban education, that both represent the shortcomings and the challenges, as well as the amazing people working there, the communities who fiercely, defend their values and their cultures and uplift each other, while talking about some of the issues at the same time. So that was kind of my takeaway. I really appreciated watching these films and this show, because I don't watch a lot of stuff. Honestly, y'all, I watch Golden Girls like all the time. I don't watch much. So it was really nice to be able to see things and watch new films that I enjoyed, and some new messages and some different ways for me to think about things.